Come sit a minute. Pull up a chair. Let's talk about something that's been simmering, quite literally, on stoves for generations and that's gotten a whole new life in the wellness aisle. Bone broth. I want to do something a little different with this one. I'm not going to tell you a story about a magic fix, because I don't think you need another one of those. And frankly, I don't think you'd believe me if I tried. What I want to do instead is walk you through what bone broth actually is, what the real evidence says it can and can't do for your joints and your skin, and then give you a proper, detailed recipe for making it the old, slow way, because that part, at least, is worth doing right. A pot that's been simmering longer than you think. Before we get into the science and the recipe, I want to take a minute on the history because I think it actually matters for how we think about this food. Bone broth, in one form or another, shows up in nearly every culinary tradition on earth. French cooking built an entire foundation on it, what they call fond, the base for classic sauces made by slow-simmering bones for hours. Chinese cooking has its long-simmered stocks, used as the base for soups that take a full day to prepare properly. Jewish tradition has chicken soup simmered with bones, sometimes only half-jokingly called Jewish penicillin. Latin American kitchens have caldo de huesos. Korean cooking has seolong-tang, an ox-bone soup simmered for as long as a full day until it turns milky white. Vietnamese pho starts with a beef bone broth simmered for many hours with charred onion and spices. None of these traditions developed because anyone in the kitchen had heard the word collagen. They developed because people figured out, through plain, practical experience over generations, that simmering bones a long time produced something nourishing, something that stretched a small amount of meat into a meal for a family, something that seemed to help people recover when they were sick or worn down. The science came along much later and gave us a vocabulary for what was already happening in those pots, but the practice itself is older than the explanation. I think that's worth sitting with for a second, because it cuts both ways. On one hand, it tells you this isn't some new fad invented by a wellness influencer with something to sell. People have been doing this independently all over the world for a very long time, which suggests there's something real and useful here. On the other hand, it's also a reminder that tradition and folk wisdom, however old and however widespread, aren't automatically the same thing as proven medicine. Lots of traditional foods are nourishing and worth eating without being miracle cures for any specific condition. Bone broth, I'd argue, belongs in exactly that category. Genuinely good, genuinely old, not magic. Why joints start talking to you. If you're somewhere in your 40s, 50s, 60s or beyond, you've probably noticed it. Getting up off the couch takes a beat longer than it used to. Your fingers feel stiff some mornings before they loosen up. A long day on your feet leaves your knees announcing themselves that night. That's not imagination, and it's not just getting old in some vague, hand-wavy sense. There's a real biological story behind it, and understanding that story is more useful than any single remedy, because it tells you why broth might help a little and why it absolutely won't fix everything on its own. Cartilage, the smooth, cushioning tissue at the ends of your bones, is built largely from a protein called collagen. Collagen is also what gives structure to your skin, tendons and ligaments. Starting in your late 20s or early 30s, your body's natural collagen production begins a slow decline. By the time people reach their 50s and 60s, that decline has added up. Less collagen production over time means less raw material for your body to repair and maintain cartilage and skin, which is part of why both joints and skin change as we age. That's the real mechanism. It's not mysterious, and it's not something doctors are hiding from you. It's actually pretty standard material in any conversation about aging and connective tissue. The mystery, if there is one, is what you're supposed to do about it. It's worth knowing too that collagen isn't just one single thing. There are more than 24 identified types of collagen in the human body, though a handful do most of the work that matters here. Type 1 collagen is the most abundant overall. It's in your skin, tendons, ligaments and bones. Type 2 is the main collagen in cartilage specifically, the cushioning tissue at the ends of your bones. Type 3 often works alongside type 1 in skin and blood vessels. When researchers study collagen supplementation for joints, they're often specifically looking at type 2, sometimes in a special undenatured form, separate from the type 1 and 3 collagen you'd get from a general bone broth or a typical collagen powder aimed at skin and hair. That distinction matters if you're trying to make sense of why one product's packaging emphasizes joints while another emphasizes skin, hair and nails. They're not always made from quite the same starting material, even though the word collagen gets used loosely across all of it. Beyond collagen itself, your cartilage and joint tissue also depend on something called proteoglycans, large molecules that help cartilage hold water and stay cushiony and springy under pressure, and on a steady supply of certain amino acids, particularly glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline, which happen to be unusually concentrated in collagen-rich foods like bone broth. None of this is exotic biochemistry hidden away in a research journal nobody reads. It's standard material you'd find in any decent anatomy and physiology textbook. I mention it mainly because I think understanding roughly how the system works helps you evaluate any specific product or remedy with a little more confidence rather than taking someone's word for it on faith. So, does bone broth actually help? Here's where I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve that more than you deserve a tidy answer. Bone broth, made properly from bones, joints and connective tissue, does contain collagen and its breakdown product gelatin, along with amino acids like glycine and proline that your body uses to build its own collagen. It also contains minerals like calcium, magnesium and phosphorus, depending on what you put in the pot, and it's a genuinely nourishing, hydrating food. What the research actually shows is more modest than the marketing suggests. Some studies on collagen supplementation, usually using concentrated hydrolyzed collagen peptides, not homemade broth, have shown modest improvements in joint comfort for people with osteoarthritis or joint pain after consistent daily use over a period of months. The effect sizes in these studies tend to be small to moderate, not dramatic, and a fair number of studies have industry funding, which is worth knowing when you're weighing how much confidence to put in them. Bone broth itself contains far less concentrated collagen than those supplement formulations, and there isn't strong independent research specifically testing homemade bone broth against joint outcomes. So I can't honestly tell you that a cup of broth a day is clinically proven to undo joint wear. I don't think anyone can tell you that truthfully. What I can tell you is this. Bone broth is a real food, not a gimmick, and there's a reasonable, biologically plausible case that the collagen, gelatin, and amino acids in it support the raw materials your body needs for joint and skin maintenance, alongside everything else you're doing for your health, not instead of it. It's also just a wholesome, comforting thing to make and eat, the same way your grandmother's soup pot was wholesome, regardless of whether anyone had measured its collagen content. If you have ongoing joint pain, swelling, or stiffness that's affecting your daily life, please see a doctor about it. There are conditions, quote, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and others, where real diagnosis and treatment matter, and a food, however nourishing, is not a substitute for that. Bone broth can be a good addition to how you're taking care of yourself. It shouldn't be the only thing you're doing, and it's not a replacement for medical care. A closer look at what the studies actually tested. I think it's worth slowing down on the research piece a little more, because studies show gets thrown around so loosely in this space that it's almost meaningless unless you know what was actually tested. Most of the better designed studies on collagen and joint health used hydrolyzed collagen that's been broken down into smaller peptide fragments through a manufacturing process, making it easier for the body to absorb intact than the collagen in a piece of cartilage or a bowl of broth. Participants in these studies typically took a measured daily dose, often somewhere in the range of 10 grams, for periods ranging from a couple of months to about a year. Some studies focused on people with diagnosed osteoarthritis. Others looked at athletes with joint strain from training, or simply older adults with general joint discomfort and no specific diagnosis. The results across these studies are reasonably consistent in direction, but modest in size. People taking collagen supplements often reported somewhat less joint pain and somewhat better joint function than people taking a placebo, measured using standard pain and mobility scoring scales. That's a real, repeatable signal, not nothing. But it's also not the kind of effect where people go from struggling on stairs to running marathons. It sits in the same general territory as other modest, evidence-supported joint interventions. Regular, low-impact exercise, maintaining a healthy weight to reduce load on the joints, and in some cases, supplements like glucosamine and chondroitin, which have a similarly mixed and modest research record. Homemade bone broth wasn't really the subject of these trials, and that's an honest gap, not something I want to paper over. A homemade broth's collagen content varies enormously depending on what bones you use, how long you simmer it, and how concentrated you make it. There's no standard dose the way there is with a measured supplement capsule. That doesn't mean it does nothing. It means we're reasoning from biological plausibility and nutritional content rather than from a study that put broth itself through a controlled trial. I'd rather tell you that plainly than dress it up as more certain than it is. What else actually moves the needle for joint health? Since we're being honest about modest effects, it's worth naming the things that the research is actually quite confident about, because I don't want broth to crowd out the things that matter more. Regular movement is one of the best supported things you can do for aging joints. Not high-impact pounding, but consistent low-impact activity like walking, swimming or cycling, which keeps the muscles around your joints strong and keeps cartilage exposed to the gentle compression it actually needs to stay healthy. Cartilage doesn't have its own blood supply. It gets nutrients partly through the movement of joint fluid, which happens when you move the joint. A joint that's never used doesn't get spared. It tends to stiffen up faster, not slower. Maintaining a healthy weight matters enormously for weight-bearing joints like the knees and hips, since every extra pound of body weight translates into several extra pounds of pressure on the knee with every step. Strength training, especially for the muscles surrounding major joints, helps those muscles take on more of the load so the joint itself takes less. And getting enough quality sleep plays a real, if less talked about, role in how your body manages inflammation and repairs tissue overnight. None of that is as satisfying to talk about as a pot of broth, because it's not a single ingredient with a clean story. It's a handful of boring, unglamorous habits that happen to have very solid evidence behind them. I'd rather you walk away from this with that list in your head alongside the broth, not instead of it. The vitamin C connection. What's actually true? There's a piece of this that often gets exaggerated, but the underlying fact is real and worth knowing. Vitamin C is genuinely required for your body to synthesize collagen. It's not optional. It's a documented part of the biochemical pathway. This is in fact why sailors on long voyages without fresh produce developed scurvy, a disease caused by severe vitamin C deficiency that includes connective tissue breakdown, bleeding gums, and joint pain among its symptoms. That's real medical history, not folklore. What that means practically is simple and not at all mysterious. If you're eating a normal, varied diet with some fruits and vegetables, you're very likely getting enough vitamin C for your body to use the collagen-related amino acids you take in, whether from food or broth. Pairing a cup of broth with a squeeze of fresh lemon or a piece of citrus isn't going to hurt anything. And lemon juice does taste good in broth, but it's not closing some dangerous gap that most well-fed adults actually have. If anything, it's a pleasant habit more than a biochemical necessity for most people. Now let's make it properly. Whatever its limits as a joint cure, well-made bone broth is genuinely good food, and most of what's sold in cartons at the grocery store is a pale imitation, heavily salted water with a little flavouring, made quickly, not simmered long enough to draw out much of anything. If you're going to do this, it's worth doing the slow way. What you'll need. For chicken broth, chicken feet if your butcher carries them, or a mix of necks, backs and wings, parts with plenty of joints, skin and connective tissue, not just lean meat. For beef broth, knuckle bones, marrow bones or oxtail from the butcher counter. These are usually inexpensive because most people walk past them. You'll also want a large stock pot, plain white or apple cider vinegar, a few vegetables if you like, onion, carrot, celery, and whatever aromatics you enjoy, like bay leaf, peppercorns, or a few cloves of garlic. The method. Start by roasting the bones. Spread them on a baking sheet and roast at around 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 to 25 minutes until they take on some colour. This step isn't strictly required, but it adds real depth of flavour and helps the process along. Transfer the roasted bones into your stock pot and cover them with cold water, leaving a couple of inches of room at the top. Add about 2 tablespoons of vinegar and let the pot sit off the heat for 30 minutes to an hour before you turn the burner on. The acid begins working on the bone surface during this resting period, which helps draw minerals and collagen into the broth once cooking starts. Turn the heat on low and bring the pot to the gentlest possible simmer, not a rolling boil, just the occasional bubble breaking the surface. A hard boil will make your broth cloudy and can break down fats in a way that turns the flavour greasy rather than rich. Let it simmer, mostly undisturbed, for a long time. 8 to 12 hours for chicken and 18 to 24 hours for beef bones, which are denser and take longer to release their collagen and minerals. If you're using a slow cooker, set it to low and let it run overnight and through the next day. Skim off any foam that rises to the surface in the first hour or two. In the last hour of cooking, you can add your vegetables and aromatics if you're using them. Adding them too early means they'll have given up all their flavour long before the broth is done. Once it's finished, strain the broth through a fine mesh strainer, discarding the solids, and let it cool before refrigerating. A well-made broth, when chilled, should set into a soft, jiggly consistency, that's the gelatin, the visible sign that real collagen and connective tissue broke down properly during the long simmer. If your broth stays liquid even when cold, it likely didn't simmer long enough or didn't have enough joints and connective tissue in the pot to begin with. That's useful feedback for your next batch, not a sign of failure. Bone broth keeps about 4 to 5 days in the refrigerator and freezes well for several months. Ice cube trays are handy for portioning it out for cooking, while larger containers work well if you're planning to drink it as is. Common problems and what they mean. If your broth comes out thin and watery even after a long simmer, the most common cause is simply not enough joints, skin, and connective tissue relative to the amount of water. Lean meat alone won't give you much gelatin, no matter how long you cook it. Try increasing the ratio of feet, necks, or knuckle bones next time, or reduce the broth further by simmering uncovered for the last couple of hours to concentrate it. If the broth turns out cloudy rather than clear, that almost always means it boiled too hard at some point rather than holding a gentle simmer. A rolling boil agitates fat and fine particles into the liquid instead of letting them rise and get skimmed off. It's not harmful, just less refined in appearance, entirely fine to drink, just won't look as polished. If the flavour turns out flat or greasy, it usually means too much fat was left in rather than skimmed, or not enough aromatics were added. A splash of vinegar or lemon juice at the end, after cooking, can brighten the broth that tastes a little dull, separately from the vinegar added at the start for mineral extraction. If you're short on time, a pressure cooker or electric multi-cooker can produce a reasonably good broth in 2 to 3 hours instead of the full, slow simmer, though most people find the flavour and gel quality a bit less developed than the traditional long, slow method. It's a fair trade-off if a full day on the stove isn't realistic for your week, and it's still a meaningful step up from a store-bought carton. Variations worth trying. Once you've got the basic method down, there's plenty of room to make it your own. A few ideas. Adding a few dried shiitake mushrooms and a piece of kombu seaweed in the last hour gives the broth a savoury umami depth that works beautifully if you're using it as a soup base. A spoonful of turmeric and a few twists of black pepper added near the end brings warmth and colour. And black pepper actually helps your body absorb the curcumin in turmeric more effectively. Roasted garlic added whole with the skins on during the last hour and squeezed out before straining adds a mellow sweetness without the sharper bite of raw garlic. For a beef broth with more body, a tablespoon of tomato paste added during the initial roasting step deepens the colour and adds a subtle richness. If you want a broth on the lighter side, for sipping rather than cooking, you can dilute a strongly concentrated batch with hot water to taste. Concentrated broth freezes more efficiently anyway, since you can stretch a smaller frozen block further when you're ready to use it. How to actually use it. You can drink it warm on its own, with a little salt and a squeeze of lemon if you like. It also makes an excellent base for soups, stews, risottos and braises, in place of regular stock. There's no required ritual or specific time of day that makes it work better. That's more about personal habit and routine than anything biochemical. Do it in a way that fits naturally into your life, because that's what will actually make it something you keep doing. A few honest questions people often ask. I want to address a handful of questions that tend to come up, because I think the honest answers are more useful than the ones you'll find on a product label. Is store-bought broth or stock useless? Not useless, just generally weaker. Most commercial broths are simmered for a fraction of the time homemade broth is, partly for cost and production speed, so they contain less collagen and gelatin and tend to lean on salt and flavouring for taste instead. If you check the label, a broth that doesn't gel at all when chilled is telling you something about how little connective tissue actually went into it. They're a reasonable convenience option, just not equivalent to a properly simmered homemade batch. Can you drink too much bone broth? For most healthy people, a cup or two a day as part of an otherwise balanced diet is perfectly reasonable. Because broth can be high in sodium, particularly if salted heavily during cooking, people managing blood pressure or kidney conditions should pay attention to how much salt goes into the pot and talk to their doctor about how broth fits into their specific dietary needs. Broth made from bones can also contain trace amounts of heavy metals like lead, depending on the source of the bones and how long it's simmered. The amounts found in most studies are small. But if you're drinking it daily over a long period, sourcing bones from a trusted butcher rather than an unknown source is a sensible precaution. Is bone broth a good source of protein on its own? It contains some protein, but generally less than people expect, and the amino acid profile is skewed heavily toward glycine and proline, rather than a complete, balanced protein profile. It's better thought of as a flavourful, nourishing addition to a meal than as a replacement for meat, eggs, beans, or other primary protein sources in your diet. Does it matter if I use chicken or beef bones? Both work well and contain meaningful amounts of collagen, with some differences in flavour and richness. Chicken broth tends to be lighter and more neutral, beef broth richer and more full-bodied. Mixing bone types, say chicken feet with beef knuckle, is common in many traditional kitchens and can balance flavour and gel quality nicely. Is there a best time of day to drink it? Not in any way the evidence actually supports. Some people enjoy it first thing in the morning as a warm, savoury start to the day. Others prefer it as an afternoon pick-me-up or alongside dinner. Pick whatever fits naturally into your routine, since consistency over time matters more than the specific hour on the clock. The honest bottom line. Bone broth is a real, nourishing, traditional food with a genuine, if modest, connection to the collagen and amino acids your joints and skin use as building blocks. It is not a miracle cure, and anyone who tells you a cup a day will reverse decades of joint wear is overselling it. The same goes, frankly, for a lot of what's sold in that pharmacy aisle with the gold lettering. Some collagen supplements have decent research behind them for joint comfort. Some don't, and price alone doesn't tell you which is which. If your joints are bothering you in a way that affects your daily life, the most useful thing you can do is talk to a doctor about it, not instead of good food and good habits, but alongside them. Pair that conversation, if it's relevant for you, with the things we know matter most: regular movement, strength around the joints, a healthy weight, and good sleep. Bone broth can be part of a sensible, well-rounded way of taking care of yourself. It was never meant to be the whole plan, and it doesn't need to be oversold to be worth making. If you try a batch this week, let it simmer the full time, let it set up in the fridge, and see what you think. There's something genuinely satisfying about a slow-cooked pot of broth filling the kitchen with that smell over the course of a day. The same smell that's filled kitchens in cultures all over the world for longer than anyone's been keeping track. Whatever its effect on your knees turns out to be, that part at least isn't a claim I need any study to back up.